hen mallards in the mid-continent back in the late 70s, early 80s. We were shooting like just under 20% of them, and the population was growing.
It was insane, right?
Yeah.
Like I think like Drake mallards was even worse.
Oh yeah, and juvenile.
We're killing like a quarter of them, and the population was growing, right?
Juvenile males was stunning how high it was, and so that's why we have to ban so many snow geese. Is our harvest rate is minuscule.
You are tuned in to the FowlWeather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York.
So today we're going to get a Canadian perspective from Frank Baldwin, who's the migratory bird biologist in Manitoba. And Frank has a lot of experience. He's worked with the province of Manitoba as well. Now he is with Environment and Climate Change Canada, which a lot of you will more so recognize as the Canadian Wildlife Service. Frank has just a ton of amazing background, a lot of family history as well in the waterfowl world, but he was born and raised on the famed Oak Hammock Marsh. A lot of you will recognize that. There's a Ducks Unlimited office at Oak Hammock Marsh. I think that's how a lot of people recognize it, Frank. But you are your own being, but you are also the son of Dr. Frank Baldwin. So welcome, Frank. Really appreciate you being here to talk Canadian prairie conditions with us.
Well, yeah, appreciate you having me on, Mike. And first of all, my late father, he was actually not a waterfowl biologist, but he was a very passionate waterfowl hunter, and he was very associated with Ducks Unlimited Canada, and he was actually a medical research scientist by training, but he definitely moonlighted in waterfowl and wetlands.
When you Google him, you get all these pictures of him in, waterfowl hunting garb. And you do look through his history, and there is all that involvement with DU and such. So,
and a lot of that work he did, throughout his career, but a lot post-retirement. But he would be thrilled to be seen as a waterfowl biologist.
Yeah, no. So a lot of family. You guys grew up with a lot of retrievers. You're kind of a dog family as well.
That's right. Yeah, my parents had a kennel of labs, Barclay Labradors, and my dad was involved in the field trials for a long time, and sold dogs all over the U.S. and Canada, and absolutely big dog family. Grew up on a mixed farm, livestock, and like you said, close to Oak Hammock Marsh, so big staging area for eastern prairie population Canada geese. And back in those days, in the 80s, early 90s, big staging area for snow geese also. Not so much anymore.
So you saw the lows then too, right? Like as a kid, you must have seen those low duck numbers before they kind of increased throughout your, more, I guess, teens and 20s, or not, Frank?
Yeah.
Where were you?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I've been tagging along with my dad since I was probably 2. And then, started hunting obviously as a young kid. But I think in Southern Canada, we're, especially on the prairies, hunters are kind of buffered from those low years in a lot of ways. And not so, we're dealing with birds when they're very naive. Even when there's lower numbers of juveniles, we're dealing with pretty naive adult birds, and just an abundance of waterfowl in general. So I don't know that as a hunter, I don't know that you necessarily recognize those low years the same way that other places do, where they're really affected by weather changes and things like that. So we're lucky to be at the top of the flyway.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, some of it's like, and we'll get into prairie conditions and things, how those swing, right? It might be the type of water you can hunt based on what's available, because the prairies are super dynamic, right? Like that has an influence on the type of hunting you might do. But yeah, I mean, the birds are there. They're coming out of you got all your boreal birds too, which is a much more stable habitat that you guys are taking advantage of, and just below that. And as soon as they jump out of that, they're, brand new and Pretty dumb. Pretty dumb. So
in those years, yeah, the big changes. I mean, in those years too, our season. When I was a kid, our seasons opened a lot later than they do now. So our duck season opened about September 21st or so. Now it opens September 1st. So we can take advantage of those early migrants like teal that we never used to be able to before. We get a lot of good hunting, especially when molt migrant Canada geese come through in early September. So yeah, the opportunities are a bit different than they were. Our family was a bit unique because we did hunt a lot of water. Well, we primarily hunted water. And my dad was a big diving duck hunter. And so contrary to most hunters on the prairies, residents who are hunting fields, we are out hunting big water.
Yeah.
So we kind of had that.
You kind of had that to yourself lots of times, I'm guessing.
Yeah, the real competition we had in those days was from guys from your old neck of the woods at Long Point. There's a fair number of diving duck hunters from southern Ontario that would make their way to Manitoba to chase cans and redheads. Our limits were a little bit more liberal, and abundance of birds, and typically could extend their season by coming west.
Yeah. Yeah, and get there early before the birds showed up to them, right? And got into like Lake St. Clair and Long Point and places further east. That's cool. Hey, so you've done a lot of, and you said as we were pre-gaming on here, you're into kind of local goose banding, but you also kind of direct Arctic goose banding in Nunavut. Is that like what portion? Is that a large portion of your position?
That's a big chunk of our position. Yeah, So I'm based in Winnipeg, and we operate a bunch of local monitoring programs. So our portion of the BPOP survey, giant Canada goose banding, duck banding. We do some age ratio work on Arctic nesting geese and cranes, and some other kind of smaller survey work, woodcock, things like that. But the Arctic banding program's probably the biggest. Well, it is for sure the biggest program that I run, and it's throughout the Eastern and Central Arctic. So 5 different programs throughout that area.
Okay. And we also a lot of folks will recognize Ray Alasaskis's name from a lot of discussion about kind of Lincoln Peterson estimators that he uses now to estimate along with colleagues to estimate populations. But Ray was your graduate supervisor, and that was a goose project as well, or?
Yep, that's right. Yeah, I worked on a colony of Ross's geese, cackling geese and Ross's geese. Jason Caswell and I worked together. Jason, and so both of us were students under Ray, kind of in the mid 2000s there. So fortunate to be at University of Saskatchewan at a time where there was Ray, Bob Clark, Keith Hobson. So some of the kind of dominant figures in waterfowl work in those years, and just a ton of really great grad students and postdocs. So I feel fortunate to be there at that time.
Yeah, that's a great list of names right there for sure to work with. We got Keith Hobson over here now. He's at Western University in London, Ontario, and we collaborate a lot with him. He's the stable isotope guru, right? So
absolutely, yep.
Nice to have him over this way and working closely with him on a lot of cool topics. I think to revitalize stable isotope work with waterfowl. So. But yeah, great list of band characters there, let's say. So Frank, the topic we really want to hit on that everybody wants to hear about, and everybody's worried about dry prairies, declining duck numbers. North Dakota's report just came out that shows declines in just about every species. So what do your conditions locally look like, across Manitoba right now? I mean, I heard something like, or actually I dug it up too, but it looks like it started raining in May. Like you guys had a really dry, snowless winter, really bad fall. We'll get into that kind of fall conditions thing for hunting in general a little bit here. But since May, it looks like May through June, you've had like 8 inches or about 20 centimeters of rain. So having spent time in Canada and a Canadian wife, I try to do things in imperial and metric for everybody, to be fair. So about 8 inches or 20 centimeters of rain. Has it helped the wetland conditions? What's it looking like out there?
Absolutely. It came a bit late. I mean, I think we're thankful the drought seems to be breaking here. we've had a lot of rain, but it did come quite late. So it came towards the latter part of our waterfowl breeding population habitat survey. So folks would be familiar with that survey in the traditional area, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, parts of Northwest Territories. So that work, we were just completing our portion of that survey. So our crew area based out of Winnipeg does Western Manitoba and Eastern Saskatchewan. And we were just in the last 2 days of that survey. So combined effort with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service. We have some other partners that are involved too, like Ducks Unlimited Canada and the provinces. And it was extremely dry until our last few days of that survey, and then we got a deluge of rain. So prior to that, the start of that precipitation, we were dealing with extremely dry conditions right across Western Manitoba, Eastern Saskatchewan, and all the other crews too in Western Saskatchewan, perhaps even drier. So just as an example, we classify wetlands on that survey. We count ducks, and we're the ground correction part for the air crew. And the ponds that we classify as type 4 wetlands, which are a semi-permanent pond, so they've got a cattail margin, and they're ponds that will be dry in about 7 out of 10 years under normal kind of precipitation regimes. A lot of those type 4s were dry. The type 5s are not supposed to ever go dry. They're always supposed to have some remnant water in the basin, and we were even seeing some ponds that have been classified as 5s. So you think of the history of the survey, more than 50 years, some of these type 5s were actually dry, and so just unprecedented dry conditions. With those dry conditions over the last few years, we're seeing a lot of conversion also. So we know about agricultural intensification, but what you tend to see in dry years are cultivation of the margin of wetlands. So as farmers can get closer and cultivate closer to the basin without getting stuck, they'll go right through the margin, the grass or the cattail margin. That'll get seeded in those years. So I think we're really thankful for the precipitation that we had, but I think it did come a little bit late maybe for this year. It might help with, re-nesting efforts. Some of the later nesting species could be a real boon for them. But just if it would have come, 3 weeks earlier, I think it would have maybe affected the settling pattern of ducks a bit differently than it will have.
But do you think, so I don't know this, like I know that when water comes back to those basins, right? So those ponds eventually go dead because the water sits in them too long, the productivity declines, all the nutrients are locked underwater, and that drying out allows things to oxidize, allows nutrients to be released. And so when the water comes back, you get this massive flush of vegetation and invertebrates with it and all this productivity. What I don't know, and maybe you can answer, maybe you can't, is like when you get it this late, is there still that, so if like ducklings are hatching and going into these kind of more ephemeral, like these wet field, like small, shallow ponds that have been created by rainwater and things, and where it's filled these edges, is there an invertebrate flush maybe that comes with that's going to help feed ducklings that need that protein, all those invertebrates and that protein to grow? Do you think that's like I don't know, even speculate, is that a thing that would still happen at this point? The Farmland Group has handled over $400 million in farm sales across the Mid-South and recently added some spectacular wildlife management expertise, particularly for waterfowl and waterfowl hunting, to their diverse portfolio. Maybe you want to get started with a new duck hunting property, or maybe you want to enhance an existing property to peak performance. Look no further than the Farmland Group. With licensed agents and affiliated relationships, the Farmland Group is ready to assist clients across the states of Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Louisiana, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. You've been thinking about it for years. No need to put it off anymore. Build your duck club dream with the Farmland Group. Their expertise doesn't stop at sales. They also have extensive lending relationships with the biggest farmland and recreational lenders in the country, as well as a staff appraiser that can assist in helping value your property. Find the Farmland Group today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com.
Yeah, no, I think you're onto something there for sure. I think we could see great conditions for ducklings. I think that's probably out there in a good chunk of the prairies now with the rain that we've had. I just think maybe a bit too late to affect, settling of birds just with all that territoriality and limited number of wetlands, lots of birds. So yeah, the brood rearing period could be phenomenal. And so, for those birds that failed and survived, it could be a pretty good, strong renesting effort also. So I think there's a lot of positives to take out of it, but boy, it sure would have affected things if it was just a bit sooner. I mean, we had no ephemeral wetlands on the landscape, like just the sheet water that we think about that's early in the spring, where like you said, the flush of invertebrates you get where you'd expect to get that, and then you get a flush of grass that comes through it, provides some concealment. We just didn't have any of that. So
so is your sense, and I had a biologist further south of you that thought that most of the birds just overflew and went into the boreal because there weren't enough spots for them to settle, so a lot of them just kind of moved on, and but the ones that are there, they're going to have space, and those ducklings are going to have a lot of space, right? Like they're going to be able to spread out better and less competition among broods and things like that. But there's that must be, it's kind of what must have happened, because I can't believe we sent that many fewer ducks back north after such a mild fall, right? Like that's my sense, is that we probably sent a reasonable number of ducks back, that they just must have overflown some of that. But again, you don't have, and you commented on this when I asked you to come on the podcast, like I can't say anything about populations because that comes out in mid-August, which I appreciate. So I guess we'll see, right? Because that survey goes all the way up into the boreal as well, right? So we'll know kind of where they settled, I guess, at some point. So we talked about winter conditions and spring. Things look good. I hope we get the productivity out of the prairies for sure. It's at least we're going to probably get a good duckling to adult, juvenile to adult ratio out of this. But you guys had, it seemed like an insanely warm winter. Definitely no snow, but duck hunting season last fall, how did that all progress for you? As you transitioned out of summer into quote unquote whatever winter we had, how was that fall?
Yeah, it was poor. It was a poor season, I think, for most people. Most of my buddies, chatting through the season, overall low numbers of birds and just poor hunting conditions. A lot of low wind days, a lot of heat, a lot of mosquitoes that we're not used to, dealing with in late September, October. And then a pretty early snap off too, for what we've become used to. So I think a lot of us were hoping that we'd get an extended season into November, like we've seen a few other years where we're still hunting by the time Remembrance Day comes around, November 11th. And we were pretty much frozen up by, I think it was October 29th or so, cold and snow. And then we got really warm again in the second week of November for our deer season. We were hunting rifle deer in t-shirts.
Yeah.
So
deer love to move in t-shirt weather, right?
Yeah. It was a wild fall. Very little precipitation. We had a bit of snow at the end of October, like I said. Then it all melted. Mm-hmm. So we went into the winter with, and then hardly had any snow throughout the winter. So
that pushed out a lot of your kind of early dabbling ducks, right? Like obviously your blue wing teal are gone, but everything other than kind of mallards were really out of there after that, when that first cold snap in October came. Is that kind of what happened?
Yeah, mallards and scaup, some of the other divers, bufflehead, things like that.
So they hung on
the big water.
Yeah.
And our lake didn't freeze for a really late. Like everything was late. We have a pretty big commercial fishing industry on Lake Manitoba and Lake Winnipeg. A lot of those guys couldn't get on the ice until record late this year. Ice fishermen also waiting for ice conditions for ice fishing. So some of those birds, some of those diver species that hanging out on the big water, they could have been around through until December. I wasn't hunting that late, but yeah, we thought, and then definitely you could be back out chasing birds. But I think we did lose a big chunk of birds at end of October though.
Yeah, that's a feeling from everyone. And then, but what kind of happened with that warm up? Like you're not the only one that got it. It's not like it didn't happen all over. I mean, those birds just hung up at mid continent like crazy, and southern U.S. folks know the pain. It was horrible. I mean, I'm in central New York, which is, I mean, we're an hour from the Canadian border. We're a lot further south than where y'all are at in Winnipeg, though. Like if you really follow the line, right? So like how late are you light right now? Like our latest sunset is at 8:58 coming up here. I think tonight or tomorrow night. Like what's your sunset right now?
Oh boy, it's got to be 9:30.
Yeah.
We're on daylight. We're on daylight savings here. Let's see. Tell you here. Sorry for the delay.
No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah, 9:41
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
our sunset.
No, it's pretty crazy. It's probably up at like 3:30, 4.
Yeah, it's light then because I know we're oftentimes we're banding geese at 5:15.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
actually, yeah, sorry, our sunrise is 5:20.
Okay.
So yeah, it's long days right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's good for birds, obviously, to feed. That's why they go north. They got that many more hours, right, to feed. So, what I heard too was that folks were shooting snow geese super, super late. Like, I mean, you're in Manitoba, but Alberta, Saskatchewan, like well into where they should have been further south at that point. Like the freeze up, the big freeze just never happened. Did you stick with trying to shoot geese, or I mean, you're kind of a diver person, but you must take some time with the geese too.
Yeah, I do. I shoot enough Canada geese now in the marsh hunting ducks that I don't pursue them in the fields all that much. But yeah, they were around. I mean, our birds are here so late now. Like you said, in terms of season timing with jurisdictions to the south, a lot of times other people's dark goose season will be closed and we'll still have a ton of birds here, right? So you just feel for those hunters to the south that just missed that opportunity. But yeah, I did hear about people hunting snow geese in Lethbridge, Alberta, and like the end of like right around Christmas, I think, right around when their season closes. I think they have birds after their season closed. And I had friends that were hunting ducks in Saskatchewan in right at the end of the season in December, and they were frustrated because there was no ice. So normally those birds are a little bit easier to target in those ice holes, but there was no ice. So yeah, it was just a really unusual year, but it was a poor season for us until the very end, until the birds were concentrated at the very end, and hardly any north winds throughout most of the season. So some of the big water that I hunt on like Netley Marsh, strongly influenced by wind tides, and it's with low water, with drought and low water, you can't get in there in anything but a strong northerly, and we just didn't get them really until the end of October.
We had what I predicted from the equations we use locally, and listeners will know this. We had like what I would call 5 days that I would have went to the marsh thinking I was going to shoot ducks, right? Out of my 60-day season, like 5 good days of weather conditions, which would move birds. So there was never, other than that one October thing for you out there, that was, I would say, like birds must have just bombed out of there in mass, right? But lots of places after that didn't ever see a lot of those conditions. It was like a one and done type thing. So that's tough to hopefully hit that one single thing. So switching gears here a little bit, Frank, you guys got a bit of a new draw system in Manitoba. And I don't want to get into the politics of why that happened, but it's for non-residents, right? Non-resident draw system, unless you go through a guide, I guess. But, what's your sense of how that's working? And are you seeing less non-residents, or is it just the same? But just your sense from being from Manitoba, how that's working for folks south of the border coming in.
Sure, yeah. So just to confirm, it's a provincial regulation. It's not a federal regulation. So similar to how a lot of wildlife and migratory bird rules work in the United States, you've got all different levels of government that can make rules. And so the province, we establish federally season dates, bag limits, things like that. The province has that in their legislation also, but they brought in this new requirement around licensing for non-Canadians last year. And so, yeah, just to make sure that's recognized by folks. It's a draw system. So my understanding is that it had 100% success for everyone that was in the draw got drawn last year. And And what they've done is they've established some baseline numbers for numbers of licenses available to outfitters. So they're controlling the number of people that can go with outfitters, the number of outfitters that they have on the landscape, and then they're also controlling the number of freelance licenses that they distribute in a given year. And so really the draw in this coming year, my understanding is it will be based on this allocation of freelance hunting licenses. And I can't remember what that figure is. So depending on how many people apply this year, some people might not get drawn, or maybe everybody will get drawn. And it's a term license also. They have a couple different license categories. So they've got a license type that folks can go with an outfitter where they don't have to go in a draw. Then they have a legacy license, and that's for people that had owned like a hunting cabin or hunting lodges or land, have a history of ownership in Manitoba. They have a different license type for those people, and they can hunt longer. I think it's 3 weeks. And then they have a 1 week term license for people that go on the draw, where I think it's 7 consecutive days, I believe is what it is. So we didn't really have a full season yet where there is a necessarily restricted number of people, at least by license numbers. So yeah, my sense, I don't know that it's hard to tell on the ground, what kind of effect there is in terms of non-resident participation, mainly because I'm not so much a field hunter. So I'm not dealing with some of the competition issues that there is on agricultural land. I hunt mostly water, and there tends not to be as much competition on water as on land in Canada.
Right.
So I think the proof will be in the next few years to understand how subscribed that draw is, and my understanding is that it was a kind of a collaboration between the Manitoba Wildlife Federation and the province and the outfitters to kind of come up with this agreement on how many licenses there will be available to these different groups. So
yeah, and I mean South Dakota's done it for years, so I don't know if they've always had it or when it got instituted, but nobody complains about that. It really spreads people out, and the hunting is pretty high quality. So I think time will tell how this all runs through for Manitoba, and hopefully it's not prohibitive to hunters. I think that's the biggest thing, right? That it continues to make it a quality experience for everybody. And maybe I don't know what the whole thought process was or is on it, but I don't know. I'm gonna think positively about this, that the intent was to help out rather than to maybe serve a few type thing. So
I think so too, and I think a lot of people look at this and say, oh, this is something that the outfitters have really driven, but the outfitters I think have gone through a lot of pain with it also. Mm-hmm. So they don't necessarily have as many licenses as they want. Not every outfitter has as much as they'd want, but they've come to a decision on how many licenses are available, and they used data from I think the last 3 years to come up with how many individuals an outfitter was taking in a given year. So as a kind of way to establish who gets however many licenses. And so I think that's the goal, is to try to protect access a little bit and hunting quality for everybody. Mm-hmm. And I think it comes at a time, post-COVID, where there was a lot of concern about access. And so when the Canadian border was closed down during COVID, everybody heard about what was going on in some of the northern states, like North Dakota, that were dealing with unprecedented numbers of people that came there. I heard some stories of incredible competition for fields. And so I think the province was looking to create a system where they don't have to deal with something retrospectively. They can be a little bit forward thinking, and very, very controversial decision though.
It was, for sure. And maybe, as I said, I'm just being optimistic that they were being proactive here on something. So we'll see how we'll let it ride and see how it turns out. So, hey, back to your Arctic goose world and changes in the Arctic and how it affects goose populations. Our Atlantic population of geese, that go up to the Ungava Bay area, primarily recently have had really poor hatches with these late spring snowfalls. And it seems to potentially be a changing climate thing where we're getting these May snowfalls, kind of these nor'easters that spin backwards and dump like a foot of snow right when goslings hatch. And I mean, that's obviously like 100% mortality for goslings at that point, right? And so that's really impacted our seasons to some extent, because you can't just pound. I mean, geese aren't like ducks, right? Like ducks, you can shoot them through the bottom, and it's a totally different bottom of the population. It's a totally different dynamic where they're short-lived and they reproduce like bunnies, and they can quickly recover from a population decline where geese produce, less eggs. So you just can't constantly pound that adult population to the degree that you can shoot ducks. And so, we have to, when we lose goslings year after year on these events, we have to kind of pull back that season. So, but I don't know relative, that's my eastern perspective from the Atlantic flyway, but you work with mid-continent geese. So to what extent have weather conditions changed or stayed the same in the Arctic as far as how it affects goose production in your part of the world?
Hey, let me take a second and tell you about Wildlife Strategies, a top-of-the-line wetland habitat management company. Founder Ryan Delaney knows his stuff. With a degree in wildlife management from Mississippi State University, Ryan uses science-based solutions to create duck hunting properties that deliver results. On the FowlWeather Podcast, when we say, "May your skies be filled," well, Wildlife Strategies does just that, fills your skies with ducks. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year timeframe management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Don't want to deal with contractors or agencies like USDA, NRCS? No worries. Wildlife Strategies does all the contacts for you. Also included are seed and supply procurement, hunt management guidance, access to cutting-edge technology via agricultural drone, and expert mapping and aerial photography. Opting into the 3-year plan for an annual fee gives your duck property a leg up on others. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You're not going to be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks with Wildlife Strategies.
Well, similarly, like we're seeing some really wild swings in weather in the Arctic, and over the last half decade or so, we've seen some pretty big declines in most Arctic goose populations, actually, in adult estimates of adults, and most of that we think is tied up in poor reproduction. So similar, whether it's probably being affected by a bunch of factors, but timing of spring being a big one. Big rain events in July, early July, right around hatch. So when we're talking about these populations, things like mid-continent snows, they're massive distribution. Their nesting areas are, huge spans of longitude and latitude throughout the Arctic. So they're much bigger populations in delineation than some of the other goose populations that we have a really great understanding of, things like interior Canada geese, like the old Eastern Prairie population, Mississippi Valley population. These are much bigger populations that don't have the same sort of on the ground understanding of conditions, because we're limited a bit by distribution and where research occurs, right? Because it's such a huge part of they nest over such a huge part of the Arctic. But we know that age ratios have been declining on these populations for about the last half decade, maybe a little bit longer. And yeah, we think that a lot of that is tied up in spring weather and perhaps summer weather, but also potentially some mismatch going on between gosling hatch. So this idea of phenological mismatch. So the timing of hatch is out of sync with timing of green up of vegetation.
Yep. And
we're also seeing some signatures that birds are in a lot poorer condition than they used to be historically. So snow geese, mid-continent snows have about 20% less protein reserves during spring migration than they did, in the 1970s, when the population was really growing at a high rate, late 1970s, early 80s. And we think a lot of that is related to this history of habitat alteration, where they pick up a lot of those reserves historically. So protein being like a really heavy reserve to carry, mostly water. Those birds are replenishing fat on the prairies, but they're picking up a lot of their protein in the Hudson Bay lowlands, and in the verge of emerging in the form of emerging plants.
Mm-hmm.
So we've done some work recently showing these pretty big changes in energetics of birds, and we know that is strongly associated with age ratios.
That's interesting. I was thinking, like, maybe we've converted a lot of winter wheat to more corn and soybean, because the winter wheat, as it's coming up, and if geese hit that, those shoots are relatively high in protein, right? And they can gain some of that stuff pretty far north. But as we've gotten more northern hardy varieties of corn, that we've moved corn further and further north, and so they don't have these like as many massive green wheat fields. But it sounds more like it's further north than that. It's like after they leave that open ag landscape that they're not picking up that protein. Is your sense, eh?
That's our thought. So we did some comparative work, but we also know from recent work with geolocators that some of these birds spend a long period of time in the Hudson Bay lowlands, and they work their way along that coastline to these Arctic colonies. And that's the same area that's been really strongly affected by snow geese. And, you see just like huge declines in sedges and grasses. So things like cacklers, like our mid-continent cacklers that go to Baffin, they spend about 2.5 weeks on the Hudson Bay lowlands refueling. And that's what they're doing. They're picking up protein. So they're kind of maxed out on fat by the time they leave the Canadian prairies. So they get here, say roughly they get here mid-April, the early part of the migration, and they're sitting until about mid-May. So they're kind of maxed out on fat, but they're not picking up protein reserves until they get much closer to the breeding colonies.
Interesting. So they're basically getting to kind of the snow ice line in the prairies, and they're feeding on waste grain to a large degree, getting super fat, is maxed out, and then making that big jump to their next staging area is kind of Hudson Bay, kind of lowland stuff. That's Western Hudson Bay you're talking about, right? I'm guessing.
Yeah. Even, I mean, historically James Bay for mid-continent snows even, but I think if you talk to some of those communities in that neck of the woods, a lot of those people talk about how there's just a change in they're not seeing snow geese like they used to in a big chunk of the coastline. So there's some redistribution of birds going on in the Arctic also. So we're seeing some big declines in colonies, and then other colonies emerging in other areas. But yeah, essentially what they do is work their way up, to the Canadian prairies. They go as far north as the boreal fringe. So they'll sit right on the edge of the ag, and then when the time is right, they'll make that big jump across the boreal and then work their way up West Hudson Bay. Some of them go right over the boreal, birds that are going to the Central Arctic, and they'll stop along the way also. But we think that a good chunk of the population moves along West Hudson Bay. And we know from some work that Ray has done, Railosopsis, that there's been this overall movement of light geese towards Baffin Island. So perhaps an increase in number of birds using that coastline also, which has historically been pretty badly degraded.
Yeah, they're known for moving around a lot. I mean, we did a paper for how snow geese that migrate through New York, and the old U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service maps just show like through central New York, it's all lesser snow geese coming through here. And then all of a sudden, all the guys were like, hey, these birds are big. And it seemed like the birds that used to go down the Champlain River Valley started coming into the Finger Lakes, right? And I guess following food or for some reason changing. But they do a very good job of moving and finding, not just during migration, but also, breeding colonies change. And this is where I give you folks a lot of space, because keeping track of colonies that are moving, which they do, is extremely difficult, right? So like, this is where I always wonder, and I do not downplay the quality of breeding population surveys and long-term trends, right? But like, there's a mid-continent snow goose population had that peak, and then conservation order, and then it's really declining. But the other way to look, actually, no, that's from Lincoln Peterson estimators, that in the waterfowl population survey now is from Lincoln Peter estimators, which is banding data. But the thought is that we move towards, using banding data, because tracking all these colonies is that much more difficult. Can you comment on like differentiation between flying over colonies of snow geese and counting them versus use of Lincoln Peterson estimators, and maybe does one complement the other? Is one better than the other? Is there a good way to track these populations, considering they're, kind of spread out across the Arctic?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something we think a lot about too when we're working with the flyways, and most of our Arctic goose management plans have moved towards Lincoln estimates because simply the issues with colony surveys. So they're really expensive, they're really inefficient. The landscape is absolutely enormous. So you're dealing with issues around phenology. So if you don't survey, most going back to into time, most of the colony work was done with photographic surveys. So stitching together images, and then nowadays you could use counting software to count birds. But you have to be bang on with your phenology. Phenology in the Arctic can vary by a month. So you'd have to establish a schedule of when you're going to survey these colonies. You'd have to do different parts of the Arctic in different years. Some years you get late years and you don't get much of a nesting effort. So, and then there's all the unknowns about where you don't survey, and there's so many inaccessible parts of the north, even to aircraft. So that's why we've gone towards monitoring all these population with Lincoln estimates. And as long as the harvest, so Lincoln estimates are on the surface a fairly simple equation. It's the harvest estimate that we get from joint U.S. Canadian harvest surveys, and over the harvest rate of the population, which we get from banding data. So that's the recovery rate of the birds from hunters, and then we use an adjustment to account for reporting bias. So not every hunter reports a banded bird. It's high now. It's over 90%. So it's really that's the equation. So it's the harvest estimate over the harvest rate. And there's been a lot of work done by Arctic Goose Joint Venture in recent years to refine some of the potential sources of bias, to understand them a bit more, to look at what affects precision. So, in terms of the harvest estimates and in terms of banding data, distribution of banding, all these sorts of things. So really, I think the community's gone sort of full into using Lincoln estimates, and it's because colony estimates are just, they're impractical. And for the most part, the two, except at a very coarse scale, the two don't necessarily agree.
Right.
And that's just because, like you said, we get these big swings in where birds are. So good example, we did some work on Victoria Island last year up in the Central Arctic. Southeast Victoria Island in mid-2000s had about 150,000 birds on it, roughly, breeding snow geese. And we heard this colony had really increased in size dramatically. People from the community were talking about it. So we went up and flew one colony. It had about 300,000 birds, breeding birds in it. And then there was another one further east, just a short distance, that was probably even bigger. So Victoria Island is undergoing this massive boom in production. Meanwhile, places in the Queen Maud Gulf just across on the mainland are in total population collapse. So Mitch Wiegman's been doing a lot of work following up on Ray Alasauskas' long-term program describing the changes in that colony. And then we have the similar thing going on the west coast of Hudson Bay. So where Jason Caswell and I worked, we worked on a colony of Ross's geese that was about 100,000 birds at the time, 2006. And we had some crew go up last year to do some follow-up work with some local people in the community of Arviat, and that colony is completely gone. There's
completely gone.
Completely gone. There's no Ross geese nesting there.
Is that what we hear about and we've seen the images of eat outs of the tundra by snow geese. I've always said, and they're like, well, it takes, how many years to recover, a lot, right, for that to recover. But I comment is always, well, there's a lot of tundra up there. Yeah, they're affecting it, but if they just move to another location, it could be hundreds of years before they'd ever have to move back. And tell me if I'm totally speaking on a turn, because I'm obviously a temperate nesting kind of bird biologist, right? I have not actually had a chance to get up and even ban, Canada geese and stuff up north. Unfortunately, I'd love to get there at some point. But is it a case where that's what happened? Is they ate themselves out of house and home, had to completely move, or was there some other factor that caused that complete colony collapse?
Well, we don't know that one in particular. We don't know.
Interesting.
We surveyed the same area. Using community knowledge, surveyed the same area. Came up with a very low estimate. They're all low density. It's all low density snow geese now. So it was a very dense Ross's goose colony over in the densest part of it, over 30 nests in a 30-meter radius plot. So you can picture how dense that is. It's incredibly dense. And yeah, so it's 60 birds, right? It's a nest. So there's a tremendous amount of territoriality going on. It's really noisy. And that colony, and so we've done some follow-up banding in the area. We used to have a banding program that we reignited, and we've caught 5 Ross's geese in 2 years out of over 5,000 birds banded. So we kind of confirmed that they're not there. They've moved. We don't know what distance they might have moved, but the interesting thing is that colony used to be one of the largest snow goose colonies on Wet'suwet'en Bay. It went through a dramatic decline shortly after. Actually, Dave Ankney worked up there in the 80s. It was going through a decline, and Ross's geese sort of showed up there in the late 90s en masse. I think about 10,000 of them. They wonder if they got blown by a storm or something, settled there, had success. They were tremendously successful when we were there. They were growing at a rate of, I think, about 11% a year at the time that we worked there, the 3-4 years that Jason and I worked there. Wow. So we were, when we went back there, or my staff went back there, we were thinking that this thing could be really big. We weren't expecting it to be, really, completely gone. So,
just for clarity, so, I mean, these Rosses are mixed in with snow geese, other lesser snows, right? Is that so? The Rosses disappeared and the other snows are still there, or the whole colony disappeared?
Well, pretty much the whole colony. What's left are snow geese that you wouldn't really consider them even to be a colony. They're so low density. They're scattered. Yeah. So what was there? There was still a lot of snow geese. There's still snow geese there that they'll band. This year, a couple thousand snow geese there. There's still snow geese there, but those Ross goose colony tends to be really high density nesting Ross's geese, and then there's snow geese kind of around the periphery of the colony. There's not too much mixture going on in the colony. It tends to be mostly Ross's geese. So the big change is really in the lack of Ross's geese now.
Interesting.
And that's similar to what's going on at Carrick Lake. And so we see these huge, that's a pretty short time period, right? It's 20 something years, and that's why these colony surveys have kind of limited utility for big scale management, like harvest management. Colony surveys are just, you never know what you're missing.
Well, and there's a lot of effort in that, right? It's in safety stuff. I mean, it's not like flying planes, like y'all fly all the way to the Arctic is an easy thing. I'm guessing and give me the logistics of that in brief. Like, you're probably caching fuel somewhere in between to even get to where you're going.
If we were to go back and historically there's a couple different ways. I mean, some of them are on the ground field crews, like Carrick Lake, because they're doing more than just counting birds. They're looking at nest survival. They're looking at interactions. They're looking at habitat, predators, community, those sorts of things. That work is on the ground, very intensive, very expensive. The way that colony surveys were done sort of across the Arctic was using aircraft, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service photographic planes. And so a lot of times there'd be communities in close enough proximity to where that work is occurring that they could fuel up in the community, fly out. There's still a lot of logistics, but there's not so much fueling on the tundra, caching of fuel.
Okay.
There's other ways people are experimenting with other ways of doing that work, using satellite imagery. I think there was some work published from Violet Island, Greater Snows, looking at, I think during the COVID years, maybe using satellite imagery to count birds. So there's there's ways to do that, but then you're buying imagery for those particular days, so it's still very labor intensive, and you still have to kind of know where to look.
And you're not looking everywhere when these things are distributed all over. I mean, this is kind of some of the argument with some of this Canada goose stuff is like, I mean, there's some people that are just like, just call them Canada geese because they're kind of everywhere, and why are we dividing them into populations and subspecies and all? I'm like, okay, I can see it because it's difficult, but we also want to kind of conserve that diversity in that kind of white-cheeked goose population, right? That Canada goose population as well. But, you know, in the Atlantic flyway, my sense is we've got a lot of geese kind of all over, all through Quebec, all the way up that we're not surveying. And it gives me a little bit of heartburn when we get seasons cut and things like that, because we're really focused on a few areas, right? But I think we always have to have some metric for decision making, and I that's where I see the light, right? Like it's imperfect, but we have, you know, the best information we possibly can for decision making, and it has its safety nets so that populations aren't negatively impacted, and that's the important part, right?
Yep, and you get a lot of additional information out of these, you know, the components of Lincoln estimates. You know, you get a lot of additional information out of those also. So obviously the harvest rate from that banded population, that's a core part of management plans in the Mississippi and Central Flyway. There's thresholds around those harvest rates which were established, you know, for these populations when they were in these plans. You know, they're over abundant populations, so the goal is to increase those harvest rates. And I'd say the monitoring of those that aspect of monitoring is really strong, and we know that it's harvest that is not driving these goose populations, you know, these lower goose populations. So yeah, harvest rates they're small, they're stable on adults. So snow geese, Ross's geese, they're 2 to 3% on adults. They're really, really small. And
that's crazy. That's super, super low, right? Like what mallards are like at 11% or something, and the trigger is something like 15, where it might impact the population or something. So we're not even close on mallards, but we're like probably way far away on white geese, huh?
Yeah, if you go back into time, you know, on mallards in the 1970s, 80s. So back in those days, reporting probability, so the percentage of people that report a band, it was a little bit murkier, but there's been some people that have done some really great work putting together these meta-analyses to try to look at trends in band reporting probability. So that's a caveat, is that banding reporting probability wasn't the basis for it back in those days, maybe wasn't as rock solid as it is now.
Right.
But if you use that and you look at harvest rates on things like hen mallards in the mid-continent back in the late 70s, early 80s, we were shooting like just under 20% of them. Yeah, and the population was growing.
It was insane, right?
Yeah.
Like I think like Drake mallards was even worse.
Oh yeah. And juvenile.
We're killing like a quarter of them, and the population was growing, right?
Juvenile males was stunning how high it was. And so that's why we have to ban so many snow geese, is our harvest rate is minuscule.
Yeah,
it's very small. But even with all the liberalizations that we've had, you know, hunting them for pretty much year-round, high bag limits, high possession limits in the U.S., unplugged guns, it's really not moved the harvest rate on snow geese.
It doesn't move that needle that much. And here's what people will say is, well, that's just people don't report because they don't want you guys to know how many we shot. But I always kind of chuckle because a lot of folks don't know, like, we legitimately have ways to know what reporting rates are. So if you're one of the people that doesn't report, we know that. So we're like a step ahead of you. Like, it's not like a ha ha ha, but it kind of is, right? So your numbers are fairly solid given the correction factors that we have built in. Especially the reporting rate for bands is, thanks to a lot of work by,
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and even the flyways actually for funding.
Yep.
A lot of the reward banding in recent years have kept that up, and it's high. Yeah, it's about 91% or so. So it's gotten higher.
Yeah, and they've done a great job. I mean, like, I don't hear people not report bans anymore. I think everybody, like what I just said to you, you hear once in a while, but people have understand the utility of reporting bans. And we've got a lot of people. I mean, most folks are interested where the bird came from, right? So, and how old it is, things like that.
I think so. I think, yeah, people are interested, and I think most hunters don't understand, and it would be great if they did, but they're how active a participant they are in management of these populations. The data comes from them. The harvest survey data, the hunters that participate in the harvest survey, I know that's a pain in the neck being involved in the wing survey, keeping track of your diary, that information, and reporting bans. Boy, hunters are kind of controlling their own destiny. They're the basis for these programs, and they make it a really efficient way to monitor a population also.
Yeah, do it and do it right. You are controlling your own destiny. That's a great way to state it. You're largely in charge of this. And the correction factors are in there anyway if you don't do it right. But the large majority of people are now, and it makes a big difference to participate in that. So that's a really nice point, Frank. Hey, the one thing we haven't hit on are white-fronted geese, because there's started to be like this increased focus on hunting of white-fronted geese in kind of new locations. So, we talked about Canada goose population, snow goose, Ross geese. What's the population, across the Arctic with white fronts looking like? And, how much are you guys involved with those? Do you ban many of them?
Yep. Yeah, we have a bit of a focus on white fronts. So these would be mid-continent white fronts. And we actually have a crew. We have a crew heading up in about less 3 weeks or so to ban white fronts. So we banned non-breeding white fronts. White fronts family groups tend to be quite small. They have really tight social bonds, white fronts, and they don't hang out with a whole lot of other, their kind. So banning breeding white fronts is really very time consuming. So our focus is on non-breeders because we use primarily the data from adults in harvest management. Okay. So that work's carried out in the Central Arctic. Crew will do about 1,500 to 2,000 of them a year, sub-adults and non-breeding adults. And their population's been in decline also. Their age ratios have been declining, probably related to the same sort of things that are going on with other goose populations that nest in those areas. So just declining productivity, a bunch of years of poor production. They've had some pretty good years the last couple though. So we might see them climb back out of that. I mean, that's the caveat with Lincoln estimates is your data is always a little bit old, right? Because you've got to wait for those band recoveries. You've got to wait for the harvest estimate. And hunters continue to report bands about a year after the birds are shot. So we don't produce these estimates for, it's impossible to produce them within the year. We normally are producing them with about a year to 2 time lag on them.
So mid-continent snow goose populations look like they're declining. White fronts are declining. Canada geese, like, you've got more than one population. Are they all like in relative decline, or is it mostly like the high Arctic breeders?
No, mid-continent cacklers those are birds that nest from Baffin Island, Southampton Island, West Hudson Bay, Central Arctic. Those, as a whole, they're in decline also. Not driven by harvest. They got really low harvest rates also, about 2% on adults, probably similar thing. So yeah, really all the Arctic nesting geese are in a bit of a decline right now. The steepest decline is in snow and Ross's geese though.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So something going on, right?
Something going on. White fronts, this movement of white fronts is interesting though. The eastward movement of white fronts. Yeah, we've been watching that too. You see it in our band recoveries.
But that's a migration. That's not a nesting colony thing. That's a migration thing, right? Like alone.
Yeah. That's I think so. I think it's I think we're seeing it a bit in other Arctic nesting geese too. So a good example, like the most extreme example are snow geese that have essentially moved right out of Texas. So so they're really, and even out of Louisiana to a large extent, being mostly in Arkansas now, kind of terminus of the migration being Arkansas. So
coastal rice became a thing of the past to a large degree, right? And those food resources kind of have moved to different locations for those birds. So I was amazed when I was snow goose hunting in Arkansas and white front hunting in Arkansas, big thing. You go across the river into Mississippi and people will shoot white fronts, and there is some focus on white fronts, but snow geese just get ignored completely, which I was like, I was down there in the dry this year and it was awful. We didn't shoot a duck, but I got to hang out with friends. It was great. There's a Kitchen Conversations episode way back with James Calicut while we were down there, not shooting ducks, but just chatting about, duck country in general. But there were snow geese flying everywhere each day. And I'm like, does anybody ever chase these? He goes, nah, we leave those to the Arkansas people to do that. So I thought that was fun. But yeah, white fronts, right? Like, keep moving east. So that's a thing is probably following kind of winter food resources is the thought. So
yeah, there's been some pretty neat work in recently. Javon Bank, Mitch Wiegman, Paul Link, there's a big consortium with a bunch of marked birds right now, and really interesting. I mean, white fronts have a large breeding distribution, but it's been really neat watching where all these birds go. It's just stunning how the expanse across the Arctic that they go. Yeah, I'd say they're one of the least understood of the goose species.
Yeah, and probably because of that kind of they're not like colony breeders, and they're a little more cryptic as far as those breeding pairs go, right? As compared to the non-breeding adults.
Yep, they're hard to study. Low nest density. Mm-hmm. Even our banding area there at Prairie River and the Queen Maud Gulf. There's a couple other parts. There's some places in Alaska where they do quite well capturing mid-continent birds, and then they also ban some Pacific white fronts there too. But there's one other spot in the Mackenzie Delta where we could probably band a decent number of white fronts where we don't band anymore. But the list of places to capture white fronts for banding is pretty small that we know of.
Yeah. Hey, so back to the weather, and I this is one of my things that I do on the FowlWeather Podcast is we give out these long-term forecasts. And right now I've told people, I'm like, I think I can give you, given the transition from El Nino to La Nina, that I can give you, a weather forecast for next winter already. I'm not doing it because that is, I'm sticking my neck out way more than any climatologist would do. Most of them don't give like a winter forecast until like the end of October, which to me already starts to feel like winter a little bit at northern latitudes, like for you too, Frank. But the broad, like late, January, February, March is when the bulk of that stuff hits. But it really looks like we should transition to, we've already kind of seen this transition of a pattern to more rain in the prairies as we start to transition from El Nino to La Nina. But the thought is that under La Nina, you guys should see a wetter, colder winter. So my hope is a more traditional snowpack for everybody. I really feel for the folks, by the way, in Iowa, South Dakota, and Minnesota now that are getting hammered by this rain and some real serious flood water that comes with that, right? So these things are very impactful for people. I understand that. It does produce habitat for ducks, right? Ducks hang out with water, believe it or not. That's what they key in on. And they do better when things are wet, especially in the prairies in general. But my question for you, Frank, is if we do come out of this really, quickly and we get a lot of water this summer, it stays warm because ducklings, cold and wet doesn't work for ducklings, right? When they're downy, it will kill them. They die really easily from hypothermia. But I think we're warm enough with this wet that we should be in a good situation for ducklings. But now think about next year, we get this water this summer, then next winter we get the snow, and let's just say basins just fill right back up. Like you've seen these low populations before. So what does it look like when ducks come back to the prairies? Does it happen in 1 year, or is this like climb out of that bottom of the population take several years to get there?
Yeah, I think it's going to take, they can respond really quickly, but we have some different things going on, I think, with our duck population than we did historically. So, you were at the duck conference and a big emphasis was on changing sex ratios, and mallards and other dabblers are having the same signature of being like really strong, becoming really strongly male biased populations. So that's a bit of a concern, is what's the capacity of that population to respond if a smaller part of it's female.
For sure.
So that's definitely something that's on our radar. I mean, we know the implications of those changing ratios on the BPOP estimates also. We might be dealing with a smaller, we know the BPOP it's the best survey we have, but it's got its warts also. So what's the capacity or what's the, how low really is the hen mallard population right now, for example? So I think there's some obstacles we're working against. Hopefully it's a quick turnaround.
Yeah, I kind of want to just see what happens with it, right? Like, I am always on the side, maybe somebody'd say biased, but the science leans towards guns aren't running duck populations. So I call it shoot them through the bottom, right? I think we can just keep pretty liberal limits through the bottom because we don't tend to drive duck populations, and then they will rebound no matter what we do with guns. And I want to see it, right? Because ducks aren't going extinct. That's kind of where I'm at. And so there's a lot of folks that are like, that's too big of a risk. We should scale back, right? Especially if duck populations after the survey come out low or really, really low. Let's say that happens, right? Then a lot of people are going to be like, hey, we need to pull back. But I always say follow the science. And if the science says it's not running, guns aren't running these duck populations, then I think we should continue with the models and push through that with the idea that when water comes back, that these birds will rebound. But again, what you said, that one big unknown is what is that hen mallard population or hen population in general. But let's just talk mallards, right? And how quickly, can it reboot basically? We know it can, or it has in the past. Are we in enough of a similar situation where it can do the same thing, or are we in a pretty bad spot?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. I'm on the same page as far as use the science. We know that our harvest rates are small, historically small. We've seen much higher harvest rates and probably lower populations for most of these birds, and we're not dealing with the same hunter population that we were 30 years ago. Right. We're dealing with, that's the reality of why we're not seeing us move the needle much on some of these Arctic goose populations harvest rates, because we have a lot fewer hunters. We have more birds than we thought we did probably back, decades ago when we were using wintering ground surveys, but we also have a lot fewer hunters now. So that's what our Prairie Canada mallard plan says. So the most obscure management plan in waterfowl probably, but we redid it in 2018, I think it was. And it's based on a minimum population threshold and a harvest rate threshold, Canadian harvested birds. And essentially both criteria have to be met before we invoke any sort of restriction in Prairie Canada. So that just concerns, birds on Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or regulations in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, but that's the approach we've taken. We're shouldn't be too worried until we reach harvest rates that are above where we've got some experience with.
Right. Much greater than where we are now, which if anybody can foresee the future, you can't, but you can look forward, and it's unlikely given hunter numbers and access and all that stuff. So, even I know the debate that's raged about pintails in the last little while south of the border, and we went through our own little bit of controversy when Saskatchewan went to an 8-bird bag limit on pintails. Maybe 4 or 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, but that decision was based on harvest rates. Right.
Super low harvest rates. No real connection with harvest rates and survival rates. So, yeah.
Yeah, I tell you, we're going to get yelled at in the Atlantic Flyway when we're at 3. And, everybody's like, oh, in 25, 26, we're going to 3 pintails in like Central Mississippi Flyway in the States, right? But the reality is that the model has to let you do that, right? You could still be in some type of a restrictive framework, but the Atlantic Flyway gets to stay in 3 all the time because we just don't, we shoot like less than 5% of the harvest. I'd have to go look at the numbers again. It might only be like 2% of the continental harvest of pintails. So it doesn't matter what we do. Honestly, we could probably be at 6 and it still wouldn't matter, right? but it's we're going to get yelled at. Like when I worked in Maine and we could shoot one black duck, but you could shoot like 3 in New Brunswick. You could look across the river and shoot 3. Well, there's very few hunters, and their opportunities for other ducks are lower, and there's a boundary somewhere. So those are the types of things that just happen, right? So
people say the same thing about, the mallard bag limit in Prairie, Canada, and
exactly
spinning wing decoys. People see these big kills of brown ducks, and I mean, the reality is we're responsible on adult male mallards. Prairie, Canada is responsible for 1% of the harvest rate.
Right.
1% harvest rate, 10% of the harvest. Right. So it's just, it's some context.
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at the numbers, but like Arkansas shoots more mallards than all of Canada? I think so.
I think that's right.
Yeah, because they're shooting. Right. I mean, it's like 45% of their harvest, and it's been it's lower now, right? It's like 500,000, but it's been up to like 800,000 mallards in a season. So, yeah, it's mind blowing the differences, right? So, like the province of Ontario shoots 100,000, and they're one of the actually I think a pretty big take, just because the sheer number of people that are over there in hunting. So, hey, Frank, thinking about where you are and where you got to, you're really an important person when it comes to your position and helping sustain healthy waterfowl populations in Canada. But I'd say your skill set's like super uncommon. So like the kids these days in Canada, right, that kind of take interest in game species management, how do they get to where you're at? I don't know if you saw this, but they just shuttered the doors of Fleming College in Lindsay, Ontario. My sister-in-law works for Montana Fish Wildlife Parks, FWP now, and she went through Fleming College and then went to Peterborough to finish her degree, and then on to do her master's degree at Mississippi State, and then ended up in Montana. But the point is like she had that opportunity to go to Fleming College in Lindsay in Ontario, but I have a hard time finding schools in Canada that I would say somebody wants a wildlife degree to become Frank Baldwin. This is where you go. So what is the future of folks like yourself in Canada to kind of keep this legacy, that you and lots of folks before you have started?
Yeah, that's a tough, I didn't know about Fleming College there. We've had, back when I was working in Alberta for CWS, we had students that came from there. 2 of our duck banders had come from there. They came across the country, worked for us for a year. A lot of great technical skills. So they're really sad to hear that. Yeah, I mean, we're lucky. There's still definitely the focus on waterfowl has never been all that strong in Canada. At universities, I mean, there's definitely been some exceptions, like Western University of Saskatchewan. There's some folks in BC. I think we're lucky. There's still organizations that are doing a lot of work here, though. So Ducks Unlimited Canada does a lot of work. They still do a fair bit of on the ground work. Delta Waterfowl, they've got a bunch of different projects going on in Manitoba, looking at diving duck survival. They're doing a great university tour for graduate students. So I gave them a presentation last week. Chris Nicolai there is doing a great job. He's really interested in, recruitment of new students. And then there's some exciting new positions. So Mitch Wiegman has his role with University of Saskatchewan, that endowed chair position that DU was instrumental in organizing. So some of these folks being pretty young too, right? So, having graduates, Mitch has a large number of graduate students. He's going to be around for a long time doing this work. So Arctic emphasis also. So I think there are some emerging opportunities, I'd say, at least, even though there's not widespread opportunity throughout Canada. There's some little hotspots that I think can serve as real good teaching grounds.
Well, it seems like it's spearheaded by the faculty member that's there more so than the program itself, right? And I think that's the difference between maybe the States and Canada. Like, Dave Ankney was retiring at Western when I started on, and then Scott Petrie took over his position, and I was a graduate student at Western, and that was a general. It was zoology, and then I think they went to a general biology program, I think, to broaden it. But but the individual professors built programs that had some focus on evolutionary ecology or whatever in waterfowl. And so those things still are definitely sprinkled throughout Canada. It feels like it's less than it used to be, but it's not like that very applied nature like we have in the States. It's just the difference between those two. There's a lot of theoretical work and I don't know, I don't believe in basic science, but science, more science focused than like I have a very specific management question that I'm going to answer. And so there's just differences there, but paired together, US and Canada definitely make a really nice combination to answer very large scale questions about waterfowl. So it's good to know there's some fresh blood there. Definitely Mitch Wiegman's program in the prairies is a big one too, Frank. So good to hear.
Yeah, that's a big one. There's still research scientists with Environment and Climate Change Canada also that are taking students on. So different parts of Canada, but U of S, strong emphasis there. I think there's a kind of a bit of an evolving disease interest here too. So people working a lot with high path avian influenza, other wildlife disease. That's I think where I see maybe some of the resources coming from for future students. So you just see there's a real interest amongst, that's a really diverse group of people, right? There's the human health people, then there's the animal health people, then there's all the field sort of ecological people. So I think things are a lot more interdisciplinary, like you said, than they were where people were just focusing on one particular set of questions. It seems like you kind of have to make a living, you have to be involved in a whole bunch of different components.
Oh, isn't that the truth? I mean, I think funding's declined for some of these things too, and so you gotta work as a team, and I do that, fairly regularly as well as most academics nowadays. And so having that broad outlook, and the disease thing for sure. I mean, avian influenza, showing up in cats and dogs, and now like I guess 4 people, but I mean I think it's low path stuff. I'm not sure, but it's moving.
Dairy cows,
around.
yeah.
Dairy cows, it's moving around in some interesting ways. So, and birds are the root of that. So that's definitely an avenue for funding. But hey, Frank, we covered a lot of ground, bud, and really appreciate your time. I mean, it's great to get that Manitoba specific, but also just Canadian Arctic perspective on geese and everything that we haven't had yet on the show, and talk about how changing weather patterns up there might be really screwing with stuff. And I really hope you have a more traditional fall and winter this year. I mean, ice fishing too. I feel you when you said that. I mean, I ice fished twice last year. Once was a big 3-day trip to the Adirondack Mountains, but the other one was just local, and it's the only time I could get out. And a lot of that wasn't my schedule. It was literally that there just wasn't safe ice, which is crazy for us. And for y'all on, in Winnipeg to be in the same situation just is mind blowing. But we might have you back for a quick fall migration update, like a quick 10-minute snippet and see what things are looking like in September or early October. But my sense is you're going to have a little colder and snowier winter. So let's hope for that for you. But
well, that would be welcome. We haven't been able to keep outdoor ice on hockey rinks in January. So yeah, I think most folks would welcome that. But
yeah, I appreciate that, Frank. We'd be remiss if we didn't bring up hockey too, at least once. So yeah, backyard rinks need some life too, right? So hey, we really appreciate you being on here and doing everything that you do for the ducks on this continent. I mean, I don't know that. I mean, sometimes we sit in our offices and we don't realize like how big our reach is, right? And you're honestly impacting a lot of people, a lot of duck, what I call duck people across duck country. And I think myself and all the listeners are thankful for everything you do, Frank. So really appreciate you being with us.
Well, thanks a lot for having me, Mike. Always enjoy talking with you, and be happy to be on it again sometime, and appreciate, the podcast you've created here. And I think it's great having a professional like yourself, go out and give the updates you do and talk about the subjects you do. So yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, I don't do anything else. I mean, Sundays, this is it, right? So my Sunday after, my wife loves it. Actually, honestly, I mean, everybody knows this on the podcast now. She works for DU, and Great organization, and she works her butt off. And so lots of times on Sunday afternoon, she's in the home office plugging away, and I'm interviewing folks and doing this. So, hey, Frank, are you comfortable with taking us out with the final tagline?
Sure. May your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friend.